The island nights in the South Pacific held a particular kind of darkness that Captain James Mitchell had come to know intimately, a darkness that wrapped around everything like a suffocating blanket, where the only lights were distant stars and the occasional flash of anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese-held islands. It was October 1944, and Mitchell had been flying the P-61 Black Widow for 3 months now, learning its rhythms, understanding its capabilities in ways that the manual could never teach. Tonight, like every night, he sat in the cockpit of his aircraft, nicknamed Night Hunter, his hands resting on the controls as he waited for the scramble order. The humid air clung to his skin beneath his flight suit, and he could hear the rhythmic buzz of insects in the jungle surrounding the airstrip on Tacloban. His radar operator, Lieutenant Robert Chen, climbed into the position behind him, settling into his station with practiced efficiency. If you're finding this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Your support helps us bring more untold stories from history to life. Mitchell had grown up in rural Montana, where the night sky was clear and full of stars, nothing like the oppressive darkness of these tropical nights. He'd joined the Army Air Forces in 1941, days after Pearl Harbor, driven by a fury that had surprised even himself. Flying had always been his dream, but war had transformed that dream into something harder, more purposeful. The P-61 was unlike anything he'd flown before, a twin-engine beast designed specifically for night fighting, equipped with radar that could detect enemy aircraft in complete darkness. Chen's voice crackled through the intercom. "Captain, I'm picking up something on radar. Bearing 270, altitude approximately 10,000 feet, distance 40 miles and closing." Mitchell's pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady. This was what they'd trained for, what they'd been waiting for through countless uneventful patrols. "Roger that, Bob. I'm bringing us around. Keep tracking him." The Black Widow responded smoothly to his touch, banking left as he adjusted their heading. The aircraft was heavy, not built for the kind of acrobatic maneuvers that day fighters could perform, but it had other advantages. The radar, the firepower, with 4 20mm cannons and 4 50 caliber machine guns, and most importantly, the ability to see in the dark when the enemy couldn't. 30 miles, Chen reported. "He's maintaining course. Looks like he's heading for our shipping lanes." Mitchell had heard the intelligence reports. Japanese aircraft had been conducting harassing raids on Allied shipping and ground installations, using the cover of darkness to strike and disappear. The Zeros and Bettys would come in low and fast, drop their payloads, and vanish before conventional fighters could respond. It was effective, demoralizing, and until the P-61s arrived, there had been little the Allies could do about it. 20 miles, contact is steady. The night pressed in around them, absolute and complete. Mitchell couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of his instruments, but Chen's radar painted a picture that was just as clear. This was the new kind of warfare, where technology extended human senses into realms that had previously been impossible to reach. 15 miles. He's still not reacting. I don't think he knows we're here. That was the Zero's weakness, Mitchell realized. They were brilliant aircraft in daylight, maneuverable and deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. But at night, they were blind. They had no radar, no way to detect threats until they were visual, and in this darkness, visual range was measured in hundreds of feet, not miles. 10 miles, bringing you around for an intercept course. Mitchell adjusted their heading again, his mind calculating angles and speeds. The P-61's top speed was decent, but not exceptional. However, with radar guidance, they didn't need to be faster. They just needed to be in the right place at the right time. 5 miles. Contact is directly ahead, slightly below us. Mitchell's hands tightened on the controls. His instructor back in Florida, Major Williams, had drilled night fighting tactics into them relentlessly. "The enemy can't fight what he can't see," Williams had said. "Use that advantage. Be patient. One good burst is worth more than spraying the sky hoping for a hit." 3 miles, 2 miles. The darkness ahead remained impenetrable. Mitchell strained his eyes, searching for any sign of the enemy aircraft. Nothing. Just endless black. 1 mile. He should be visible soon, slightly below and to the right. Then Mitchell saw it, a faint silhouette against the marginally lighter sky, the distinctive shape of a Mitsubishi Zero. The Japanese pilot had no idea death was approaching from above and behind. "I have visual," Mitchell said quietly. "Hold on, Bob." He adjusted his approach, bringing the Black Widow into position. The Zero continued on its course, unaware, vulnerable. Mitchell's finger moved to the trigger, but he hesitated. This wasn't like combat in daylight, where everything happened in a blur of motion and instinct. This was calculated, deliberate. He could see the enemy pilot's aircraft clearly now, close enough to make out details. Somewhere in that cockpit was another human being, flying through the night on a mission he believed was important. Mitchell pushed the thought away. This was war. The pilot below him would have no hesitation about bombing Allied positions or strafing ground troops. He squeezed the trigger. The Black Widow's cannons roared to life, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the night. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness, converging on the Zero. The first burst caught the enemy aircraft in the wing route, and Mitchell saw pieces fly off. The Zero immediately began to roll, the pilot finally aware of the attack, but already too late. Mitchell adjusted his aim and fired again. This time, the rounds walked across the Zero's fuselage. The enemy aircraft shuddered, black smoke pouring from its engine, and then it nosed over and began falling toward the dark ocean below. "Good kill," Chen said, his voice tight with adrenaline. "He never knew what hit him." Mitchell watched the Zero disappear into the darkness, a faint trail of flame marking its descent. He felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction that they'd done their job. "Mark the position and time. Let's get back on patrol. There might be more." They continued their patrol for another 2 hours, but the night remained quiet. When they finally returned to Tacloban, the first hints of dawn were touching the eastern horizon. Mitchell brought the Black Widow down smoothly, taxiing to their hard stand, where the ground crew waited. As he climbed out of the cockpit, his legs shaky from the tension and the hours of sitting, he saw Major Harrison walking toward them. Harrison was their squadron commander, a veteran pilot who'd flown Wildcats at Midway before transitioning to night fighters. "I heard you got one," Harrison said, his weathered face showing approval. "Good work?" Mitchell nodded, pulling off his helmet. His dark hair was matted with sweat. "Yes, sir. Zero. Probably heading for a shipping raid." Harrison pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and offered one to Mitchell. Mitchell accepted, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. "I've been thinking about something, sir. That Zero pilot never saw us coming. He had no warning until we opened fire." "That's the idea," Harrison said. "We have the advantage at night." "But it's more than just having radar," Mitchell continued. "The Zero itself is vulnerable at night. It's built for daytime combat, for maneuverability and climb rate. But those advantages don't mean anything when you can't see your enemy. And from what I observed, their aircraft don't have any self-sealing fuel tanks or armor protection. In daylight, they can use their agility to avoid getting hit. But at night, when they're blind and we can guide ourselves into perfect firing position, they're sitting ducks." Harrison's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Go on." "I think we've found a fundamental weakness in their night operations, sir. If we can coordinate our patrols to cover the approaches to our installations and shipping lanes, we can make night bombing runs prohibitively expensive for them. They'll have to choose between conducting raids in daylight, where they'll face our day fighters and anti-aircraft fire, or risking night missions where we can intercept them before they even know we're there." Over the next several weeks, Mitchell's theory was put to the test repeatedly. The P-61 Black Widows of the squadron flew patrol patterns based on intelligence estimates of Japanese raid routes. Mitchell logged 6 more confirmed kills, each one following the same pattern. Radar detection at long range, careful positioning, and a brief decisive attack that the enemy had no chance to counter. But it wasn't just about the victories. Mitchell started keeping detailed notes on each engagement, documenting the tactics that worked and those that didn't. He noticed that the Zeros would sometimes try to dive away when attacked, using gravity and their light weight to accelerate rapidly. The P-61 could follow but not match that initial burst of speed. However, by positioning himself above and slightly ahead of predicted escape routes, Mitchell found he could cut off those attempts. He also observed that Japanese pilots seemed to have standard procedures for night missions. They would fly at specific altitudes, follow predictable routes toward targets, and maintain steady courses to conserve fuel and avoid getting lost. These predictable patterns made them easier to intercept. Chen became increasingly skilled at reading the radar, learning to distinguish between different types of aircraft by their radar signatures and flight characteristics. Zeros fly level and steady, he explained to other radar operators. Betties are bigger on the screen and usually fly slower. If you see multiple contacts in formation, it's probably a raid group. Single contacts are either scouts or individual attackers. The intelligence officers began noticing the impact of the P-61 patrols. Japanese night raids on Allied positions decreased significantly. When raids did occur, they were smaller and less effective, as if the enemy was conserving resources or losing confidence in their night operations. One evening in November, Mitchell was called to a briefing with Harrison and several intelligence officers. Maps of the South Pacific were spread across the table, marked with known Japanese positions and flight routes. Captain Morrison, the senior intelligence officer, gestured to the maps. "Gentlemen, we've been analyzing the pattern of Japanese night operations over the past 2 months. The data is clear. Their night bombing and harassment raids have dropped by nearly 70% since the P-61 squadrons became operational. More significantly, we're intercepting communications indicating that Japanese pilots are increasingly reluctant to undertake night missions." Harrison looked at Mitchell. "Your theory about their vulnerability at night appears to be correct. The question is, how do we maximize this advantage?" Mitchell studied the maps, his mind working through the tactical possibilities. "We need to expand our patrol coverage, Right now we're concentrated around our major bases and shipping routes, but if we can establish forward patrol zones closer to Japanese airfields, we can intercept them earlier, while they're still organizing their formations and haven't reached maximum altitude. That would require forward basing some aircraft, Harrison said, closer to enemy positions. Yes, sir, it's a risk, but the payoff could be significant. If we can make them feel unsafe even near their own bases, it will further degrade their willingness to conduct night operations. Morrison nodded slowly. I'll recommend it to command. Captain Mitchell, I want you to write up a detailed tactical analysis of P-61 operations against Japanese night missions, everything you've observed, all your recommendations. This information needs to be disseminated to other night fighter squadrons. Over the next week, Mitchell worked on the report whenever he wasn't flying. He wrote about the technical aspects of radar-guided interception, the vulnerability of unarmored Japanese aircraft to sustained cannon fire, and the psychological impact of an invisible enemy. He included diagrams showing optimal attack approaches and discussed the importance of discipline in holding fire until achieving ideal position. Chen helped with the technical sections about radar operation, detailing how to interpret different signatures and track multiple contacts. Together, they created a comprehensive guide to night fighting in the Pacific Theater. One section of Mitchell's report dealt specifically with the Zero's characteristics at night. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 is an exceptional daylight fighter, but its design priorities create critical vulnerabilities in night combat. The lack of armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, acceptable trade-offs for improved maneuverability in visual combat, become fatal liabilities when the enemy can attack from optimal positions without warning. Additionally, the Zero's light construction, while contributing to its agility, makes it susceptible to catastrophic damage from heavy cannon fire. Pilots should aim for the wing roots or engine, where structural integrity is already compromised by the lightweight design. The report was forwarded up the chain of command, eventually reaching the headquarters of the 5th Air Force. Copies were distributed to other P-61 squadrons throughout the Pacific, and Mitchell began receiving letters from other night fighter pilots who had used his tactics successfully. In December, Mitchell was promoted to major and given command of his own flight of 4 P-61s. He handpicked his pilots, choosing men who showed the patience and discipline that night fighting required. Together, they refined the tactics further, developing hand signals for ground crews to speed up launch times and establishing radio procedures that minimized communication while maintaining coordination. The success of the P-61s against Japanese night operations had broader implications. With the threat of night raids diminished, Allied ground forces could conduct more extensive operations after dark. Supply ships could move with greater security during nighttime hours. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was significant as well. They had lost their advantage in the darkness that had covered the Pacific. On Christmas Eve 1944, Mitchell sat in the officers' club at their base, now located on Leyte. A small, scraggly tree decorated with whatever the men could find stood in the corner. Chen joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Merry Christmas, sir," Chen said, settling into a chair. Mitchell smiled. "Merry Christmas, Bob. How many missions is that for us now?" 43, Chen replied without hesitation. 11 confirmed kills, 3 probables. Seems like a lifetime ago that we flew our first patrol. "We've learned a lot since then," Chen said. "The whole squadron has. Hell, the whole night fighter program has." Mitchell nodded, sipping his coffee. He thought about that first kill, the Zero pilot who never knew what hit him. He thought about all the subsequent engagements, each one a small but significant victory in a vast war. "We found their weakness," he said quietly. "The night was supposed to protect them, give them freedom to strike without being seen, but we turned it into their vulnerability." "Do you think it's making a difference?" Chen asked. "In the bigger picture, I mean." Mitchell considered the question. The war was far from over. The battles ahead would be fierce and costly, but every advantage mattered, every enemy capability that could be neutralized saved Allied lives. "I think so. Every raid we stop, every bomber we shoot down before it reaches its target, that's ships that don't get hit, soldiers who don't get killed, supplies that make it through. It adds up." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the muted sounds of a Christmas celebration around them. Outside, the tropical night was as dark as ever, but it no longer seemed quite as threatening. Somewhere in that darkness, other P-61s were on patrol, their radar eyes scanning for threats, their pilots ready to exploit the very weakness Mitchell had identified. The war would continue for many more months. There would be more missions, more combat, more lives lost on both sides. But in the night skies over the Pacific, the balance had shifted. The darkness that had once been Japan's ally had become neutral territory. And then gradually, a domain where American technological superiority and tactical innovation gave them the edge. Mitchell's report would eventually be incorporated into official training materials for night fighter pilots. His tactics would be studied, refined, and taught to new generations of aviators. But on that Christmas Eve, he was just a pilot from Montana who had learned to hunt in the dark, who had found a weakness in an enemy that seemed invincible, and who had helped turn the tide in a small but significant way. Chen broke the silence. You know what's funny? Before radar, before the P-61, night fighting was mostly luck. You might stumble across an enemy in the dark, or you might not. It was random. And now it's a science, Mitchell finished. We can predict, plan, execute. The Zero pilots are still brave, still skilled. But skill alone isn't enough when you're fighting blind against an enemy who can see you from miles away. As midnight approached, marking the transition to Christmas Day, Mitchell stood and walked to the window. The airfield was dark except for the faint lights marking the runway. In the distance, he could hear the sound of a P-61 taking off for patrol. The distinctive rumble of its twin Wasp engines faded into the night. He thought about the future, about the battles yet to come. The Philippines campaign was ongoing, and beyond that lay Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and perhaps, eventually, Japan itself. The night fighters would be there for all of it, continuing their silent war in the darkness. But tonight, on Christmas Eve, Mitchell allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They had taken an enemy advantage and turned it into a liability. They had found a weakness in the seemingly invincible Zero and exploited it ruthlessly. They had made the night skies safer for Allied forces and more dangerous for the enemy. Tomorrow they would fly again. Tomorrow there would be more patrols, more interceptions, more combat. But tonight Mitchell could rest, knowing that their work had meaning, that the tactics they had developed were saving lives and contributing to eventual victory. Chen joined him at the window. To the night hunters, he said, raising his coffee cup. Mitchell clinked his cup against Chen's. To the night hunters, he echoed, and to all the pilots out there right now, making sure our people can sleep safely. The night stretched out before them, vast and dark, but no longer insurmountable. They had learned its secrets, mastered its challenges, and turned it from an enemy into an ally. The P-61 Black Widow had proven itself as one of the most effective night fighters of the war, and the tactical innovations developed by pilots like Mitchell would influence aerial combat doctrine for decades to come. As they returned to their chairs, Mitchell felt a deep sense of purpose. War was terrible, destructive, and tragic. But within that tragedy, there were moments of clarity, instances where skill and courage and innovation made a genuine difference. Finding the Zero's night fighting weakness had been one of those moments, a tactical breakthrough that rippled outward, affecting operations across the entire Pacific theater. The celebration continued around them, men finding joy and companionship in the midst of war. Mitchell joined in, sharing stories and laughter with his fellow pilots, but part of his mind remained focused on the mission, on the continuing challenge of maintaining air superiority in the Pacific night skies. In the months that followed, the pattern would continue. Japanese night operations would remain suppressed, their pilots increasingly reluctant to venture into darkness that had become deadly. The P-61 squadrons would fly thousands of sorties, achieving hundreds of victories, many of them using the tactics Mitchell had documented in his report. But the true measure of their success wasn't just in the aircraft destroyed or the missions flown. It was in the Allied soldiers who slept through nights without air raids, in the ships that delivered supplies without being attacked, in the ground operations that could proceed without fear of nocturnal bombing. These were harder to quantify, but no less important. Mitchell would survive the war, returning to Montana with a chest full of medals and a wealth of experience that would never fully leave him. He would occasionally wake in the night, his mind still in the cockpit of Night Hunter, Chen's voice in his ears as they tracked another target through the darkness. But those memories would fade over time, becoming stories to share rather than experiences to relive. What would endure was the legacy of those months over the Pacific, when a group of pilots learned to master a new kind of warfare and found a weakness in an enemy that had seemed invincible. They had proven that technology, tactics, and courage could overcome even the most daunting challenges. They had shown that darkness, which had always been humanity's oldest fear, could be conquered with ingenuity and determination. As Christmas Day dawned over Leyte, bringing light to the tropical landscape, Mitchell finally allowed himself to sleep. Outside, the P-61s continued their patrols, invisible guardians in the night sky, hunting for an enemy that had learned to fear the darkness as much as the Americans once had. The war would end, eventually. Peace would return. But the lessons learned in those night skies over the Pacific, the tactical innovations born from necessity and refined through experience, would shape military aviation for generations to come. And at the heart of those lessons was a simple truth that Mitchell had discovered. Every strength has a corresponding weakness, and victory often belongs to those who can identify that weakness and exploit it without mercy. The night had always belonged to whoever dared to master it, and in the Pacific during World War II, it belonged to the pilots of the P-61 Black Widow, the night hunters who turned darkness from an enemy shield into a hunter's blind.